The Pope, as sovereign of the Papal States, seeks not only to shepherd the Church through difficult times, but must also contend with highly charged political issues as well. This is Rome, a history in images. The Papal States are born in the 8th century and will last for over 1,000 years until 1870. We continue to visit Rome and its environs, most especially the beautiful churches of Rome. Through these visits, we explore bits and pieces of history as we go along. There's a lot to see, so let's go. Built in the 4th century on the site of an ancient Roman home near an ancient temple, and later renovated, the Basilica of John and Paul does not refer to the famous apostles. Instead, it refers to two brothers who lived centuries later. Christians who were treated well under Constantine, John and Paul were persecuted under Julian the Apostate and murdered in their own home in the mid-4th century. Their bodies were buried on site, and later on a church was built. As you walk below, you can see the remains of many Roman houses, John and Paul's old neighborhood. In the church above, a marble slab marks the spot where the two brothers were murdered. St. Lawrence outside the walls is a very important church, one that houses some important relics. It was built in the 300s and restored many times after. Near the entrance is this more modern tomb of Alcide de Gasperi, who was Prime Minister of Italy for many years. Here we see an ancient Greek sarcophagus, with the grape harvest as the theme. Behind the main altar is a large area where one can see the remains of Blessed Pope Pius IX, Pope of the 19th century and the longest reigning pontiff in the history of the Church. Near the altar we have this statue of St. Lawrence. And near the back we can see a tomb that was blown to bits during the bombings of World War II, but it was carefully reassembled. It depicts a marriage feast. Pope Mark, the only pontiff in history to bear that name, sat on the chair of Peter for about 9 months before dying in 336. But it was enough time for him to build a basilica in honor of his patron, St. Mark the Evangelist. Built in 336 and renovated many times, a visit to the church might confuse some people, for the church itself is dedicated to St. Mark the Evangelist, while the man buried underneath the altar is Pope St. Mark, who built the church. Getting its name from the fact that it is outside the walls of Rome, St. Agnes outside the walls is right next to the church of St. Costanza, which we already visited. One can access the catacombs of St. Agnes from this church. Not surprisingly, the church of Sant Agostino is dedicated to the famous St. Augustine. His saintly mother, St. Monica, is buried here. Her body rested for many years in the now empty tomb you see on the left wall of a side chapel. And here, in this altar, St. Monica's relics find their final resting place. Also in this church is the Madonna of Loreto by Caravaggio. Heavily restored since it was first built in the 5th century, San Lorenzo in Lucina is dedicated to St. Lawrence, the deacon who was martyred in the 200s. If you recall, tradition tells us that St. Lawrence was slowly roasted to death on a gridiron. Now, part of that gridiron is kept here, in this side altar. Also, the skull of Pope St. Alexander I, who died in 115 AD, is at this side altar. Alexander I was a very early pope and bishop of Rome, dying just 15 years or so after the death of St. John the Evangelist. San Gregorio al Cielo was built in the 6th century, but heavily restored later on. This 8th century church is dedicated to an ancient Roman martyr named Praesede. Unfortunately, nothing is known of this saint. Her biography is lost to the ages. This church claims to have the relic of the Pillar of the Scourging. Climb many steps to an entrance located at the top of the Capitoline Hill, right next to the Victor Emmanuel II Monument and the Capitoline Museum, and you will find this church, well worth the climb to the top. Santa Maria in Ara Coeli, or St. Mary of the Altar of Heaven, was completed sometime in the 1100s. It has some impressive relics, including those of St. Helena, the mother of Constantine. A number of people are buried here. There are also a number of statues, including this one of Pope Paul III, and this one, on the right, of Pope Leo X. As we proceed along our timeline, we find that the papacy, now in control of the Papal States, wields political power. As a result, there is often competition for the papacy, and sometimes a legitimate pope is challenged by another claimant called an anti-pope. This happened to Pope Innocent II. When he became pontiff in 1130, a group of cardinals elected an anti-pope, Anacletus II. Both popes were consecrated on the exact same day. When anti-pope Anacletus died in 1138, he was buried at the church of Santa Maria in Trastevere. This is the next church we will visit, but first a little background because it was built initially by Pope St. Calixtus I. Do you remember Pope St. Calixtus I? We spoke about him earlier. He was the pope who was murdered in his own home back in 222 AD, his body thrown into a well located on the property. His body was then moved to the catacombs. Well, about 900 years later, Pope Innocent II is pope, and Antipope Anacletus is the anti-pope who has just died and was buried in Santa Maria in Trastevere. Pope Innocent II decides to rebuild the church and take out the tomb of Antipope Anacletus. Then the church is rebuilt, and Pope Innocent moves the relics of Pope St. Calixtus from the catacombs to this church. The exterior is a kaleidoscope of images from different eras. The mosaic you see dates from the 1100s and depicts the wise and foolish virgins visiting the Madonna and Child. Above the mosaic is a faded fresco that was painted 700 years after the mosaic was made. The painted fresco from the 1800s has faded due to weather, while the much older mosaic has endured. The portico in front, topped by marble statues, dates from 1702. The interior is famous for its impressive mosaics. Do you remember the baths of Caracalla? Columns from the baths were brought here and incorporated into the new church. Below the main altar, below the icon of Jesus and behind gold grille work, lies the relics of Pope St. Calixtus I, the pope martyred at his nearby home in 222 AD. Also buried here is, guess who? The pontiff who rebuilt this church in the 1100s, Pope Innocent II. We return to our timeline as we move through history. The barbarian societies throughout Europe gradually transform into kingdoms. These kingdoms usually have a king as ruler, then in steps below, nobles, merchants, and then the peasants, or the majority at the bottom. No one really owns land. Instead, a servant or vassal signs a contract with a lord in which the vassal receives land in exchange for service and loyalty to that lord. This system is called feudalism. The church receives many grants of land until it becomes the greatest of all landowners. This is a great strength in that it allows the church to grow and develop. It is also a great weakness, as leaders in the church at this time are often given to greed and corruption. This includes some bishops, many of whom are often wealthy and ambitious, as well as some popes, though papal infallibility is never in jeopardy, thanks in large part to the guidance of the Holy Spirit. The popes, faced with many challenges, often have to adjust to difficult political situations. A total of 7 popes live in Avignon for nearly 70 years, beginning in 1309. A notable saint of the 14th century is St. Catherine of Siena. She is a great mystic and writer. She is also very persuasive. She is the one who convinces Pope Gregory XI to leave Avignon and return to Rome. Let us visit some more churches of Rome. A 13th century church dedicated to St. Francis of Assisi, San Francesco a Ripagrande, is quite beautiful. Here you can visit the tomb of St. Carlo d'Assezze, a Franciscan who died in 1670. You can also see a sculpture by Bernini depicting Blessed Ludovica e Bertoni. Work was being done while this photo was being taken. I was fortunate that the camera could still see this great work of art through a space in the scaffolding. Santa Maria de' Miracoli is located in the Piazza del Popolo and gets its name from an icon located above the altar. A woman prayed to the icon after dropping her baby into the river. When the baby was saved, the icon became a treasured image and was housed here in St. Mary of Miracles. Also here is the final resting place of St. Candida. A martyr initially buried in the catacombs, her relics were moved to this church. An artistic likeness of the saint is seen here, while her actual relics are located in an urn near the feet. Also located in the Piazza del Popolo, Santa Maria del Popolo was built in the 1400s. Near the entrance is this strange but intriguing sculpture meant to symbolize the dead who are looking forward with hope to the resurrection. The beautiful Chigi Chapel has this amazing statue of the prophet Habakkuk by Bernini. The Cerasi Chapel has 2 famous masterpieces by Caravaggio, the Crucifixion of St. Peter and the Conversion of Saul. Santo Stefano Rotondo is the national church of Hungary and is named after both St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, and King St. Stephen, the first king of Hungary. San Pietro in Montorio is on the Janiculum Hill and offers a beautiful view of Trastevere. Construction on this church was completed in 1494. Rome of the 1500s is a city that is beginning to flourish once again, though the church has been through some great difficulties. The previous 300 years saw many conflicts between emperors, kings, and popes. One of the most notable casualties was St. Thomas Becket, a friend of King Henry II who, after many church-state conflicts, was hacked to death in his own cathedral by the king's soldiers. Islam, founded by Muhammad in the 600s, had a strong hand which took Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria within a 5-year period. Many Muslims took Christians into slavery. The Crusades had sought to free the Holy Land from Muslim control. During the Second Crusade, large number of Christians were slaughtered by Muslims, their decapitated heads collected by Saladin as trophies. The ensuing Crusades often in return featured brutal and violent behavior by the Crusaders themselves. The Western Church and the Orthodox Church of the East made a final decisive split in 1472. Now, in the year 1500, the Church is flourishing with the promise of the Renaissance. At the same time, it suffers from corruption and is in need of reform. Both the Catholic Church and Rome itself are about to go through some dramatic changes. This we see in our next episode.